I want to invite you this morning to open in your Old Testament to Ruth chapter 2. Ruth chapter 2 is where we will take our study from. And as we begin, as you're turning there, let me take just a moment to set the stage for what we're going to talk about this morning. Although this book bears Ruth's name, it is in large part a story about a woman named Naomi. She moved from Israel to Moab with her husband and with her two sons because there was a famine in the land. She lost all three of them in the land of Moab, and that left her in a very difficult situation. She had no husband, she had no sons, and she had no real hope for the future, or at least that's the way she saw it. That's what she thought. But what Naomi did have was two Moabite daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth. And she didn't think that having them return with her to Bethlehem would help anybody involved, wouldn't help them, wouldn't help her. And so she tried to persuade them to go back to their families. And Orpah took her advice. She went back to her family. But we're told in chapter 1 in verse 14 that Ruth clung to her. She held on tightly. And Ruth's words on that occasion have become famous, and for good reason. In verses 16 and 17, actually, of chapter 1, go back there for just a second. Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. And may the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." And so Naomi returned to Bethlehem with Ruth at the beginning of the barley harvest, we're told. And that's where we're going to begin in our reading this morning. Let's start in chapter 2. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." And so she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." And then Boaz said to his young man, who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." And she said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers." And so she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. And then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." And then she fell on her face, and bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." And then she said, "I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants." And at mealtime Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine." And so she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. And when she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her." And so she gleaned in the field until evening. And then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned, and she also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. And her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." And so she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked, and said, "This man's name with whom I work today is Boaz." And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." And Naomi also said to her, "The man is a close relative of ours, one of our guardian redeemers." And Ruth the Moabite said, "Besides, he said to me, you shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest." We'll go ahead and stop there. There's still a little bit left, but we'll stop there. I pointed out before in this study that the book of Ruth is a love story. And it's a love story on a number of different levels. It tells us about the love of God for his people. That's part of the story. It tells us of the love between a daughter-in-law and her mother-in-law. It also tells us of the love that is going to develop between a wealthy Israelite and a poor foreign girl. We read about Boaz and Ruth. And so the verses that we read just a moment ago, they mark the beginning of that relationship. And in our study this morning, it's going to kind of center around what we find about each one of these people, or each, at least Boaz and Ruth. And so the first thing that I want us to do in our lesson this morning is just talk about some of the notable things that are revealed in this passage about these two people. And the first thing that I want you to see is that Ruth is portrayed in this chapter as a model of responsibility. A model of responsibility. And let me explain what I mean by that. In those days, if you were a widow, and if you were childless, and if your husband, didn't have any brothers to marry you and take care of you after you were gone, you were in the most desperate situation in which a woman in that society could find herself. And so you basically had, one of two options, either some form of welfare or some form of immorality, to be honest. And so among the provisions made for the less fortunate in ancient Israel was a practice known as gleaning that we read about in this chapter. And as the workers would harvest the grain, some of it would fall to the ground. And the law of Moses had said that they were not, if it fell, they were just to leave it there. You didn't go back and pick it up. It also said that they were not to harvest all of the grain from their field. They were to leave some along the edges of their field. And the Lord had commanded the Israelites to do these things for the needy and even for the foreigners who lived among them, who lived in their midst. So back in Leviticus chapter 23 and verse 22, it says there, "When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge, nor shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner." And there are really several passages along those lines that deal with that in the law of Moses. God told the Israelites that he gave them this particular commandment. And the reason he did that was because he didn't want them to forget where they had come from. And so we read in Deuteronomy chapter 24 and verse 19, kind of have the same command just reiterated. "When you reap your harvest in your field, and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands." And then a couple of verses later, in verse 22, "You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore I command you to do this." You were in a desperate situation at one point yourself, and I don't want you to forget that, so that you don't fail to treat those who are in a desperate situation in the right way. And so this was one of the ways they took care of the needy and the orphan and the widow and the stranger in Israel. It wasn't the only way. They also, every third year, the tithe that they would bring in would be for this same group of people. But this was one of the ways in which they did that. And typically speaking, it would provide only a meager existence. But it was at least one way to help take care of people, again, who were in a desperate situation. And it was not uncommon, though, for many of God's laws to be ignored during the time of the judges, really at almost any point in Israel's history, but this was an especially bad point in Israel's history. And so when you look at what is said in the book of Ruth, you kind of read through it, it doesn't seem that there was any guarantee that the owner of a field or his servants would allow someone to glean. And so when you look at, say, verse 2, and Ruth says to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor," that's not a guarantee. Down in verse 7, she asked the question, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers." And so she came and she was allowed to do that. She continued from early morning until, later on, just with a brief rest. And Boaz will say to her in verse 8, "Listen, my daughter, do not go glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young." Why? I want you to be around other people. "Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? I don't want you to be assaulted in some way. And when you're thirsty, drink from the water that they've drawn." And so you can see that Ruth was committed to doing anything she could do to take care of her mother-in-law. She put herself in a very difficult situation. And one thing you find in this chapter is that Ruth was not afraid to work in order to take care of not only herself, but also of someone that she loved. That's what I mean when I say that she is a model of responsibility. You know, when you look at many of the women who were praised in, especially the Old Testament, they were not praised as much for their beauty as they were for their work. And I find that interesting. They were praised for working and for supporting their families at a time when just about everybody had to pitch in just to survive. And so I want you to think with me for just a moment about the passage that we typically look at when we look at the epitome of what a woman is supposed to be, Proverbs chapter 31, and just notice some of the things that are found there. In Proverbs 31 and verse 10, an excellent wife who can find? She is far more precious than jewels. The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not harm all the days of her life. She seeks wool and flax and works with willing hands. She is like the ships of the merchant. She brings her food from afar. She rises while it is yet night and provides food for her household and portions for her maidens. She considers a field and buys it. With the fruit of her hands, she plants a vineyard. She dresses herself with strength and makes her arms strong. She perceives that her merchandise is profitable. Her lamp does not go out at night. And we could go on and on and on. It talks about what she does with her hands. And you can see in that chapter that physical attributes had nothing to do with her being a worthy woman. Now, we don't know anything about Ruth's looks. There's no picture Bible, go back and look at what she was like. Maybe she was attractive. Maybe she was not. We don't know. Either way, what I find interesting is that the author of the book that bears her name emphasized the beauty of her character. That's what is emphasized in this chapter. She was willing to work hard and labor tirelessly to take care of another person who could not take care of herself, who couldn't add anything to the situation, actually. She was a model of responsibility. But not only do we find that, we find out something about Boaz from this chapter as well, and that is that he is a model of generosity. When you look at what is said in the Old Testament, it'd be hard to find a better compliment for a person than to say that he is generous. That's a pretty good indicator of whether or not someone was going to be faithful to God. And so in Proverbs chapter 14 and verse 31, for example, whoever oppresses a poor man insults his maker, but he who is generous to the needy honors him. It is a way to honor God. And the second half of that verse certainly describes Boaz, describes who he is. Look at what is said about Boaz in the first verse of this chapter, in verse 1 of Ruth 2. Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man, my translation says, of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And that word is translated different ways in different translations. It's the word worthy, or in one translation I know it uses the word wealthy, and it can mean that. It has a variety of meanings when it's used. And it could be used to refer to a person of considerable financial resources, but it could also be used to refer to a person of considerable moral character. In chapter 3 of Ruth, in verse 11, Boaz is going to refer to Ruth as a worthy woman. And he's not saying she's got a lot of money. That's not the point he's making up. She didn't have any. It is her character that he is highlighting there. One translation says she is a woman of noble character. And so one of the ways this word can be translated is by the word substance, and that would describe Boaz regardless of what's under consideration. He was a man of great substance, yes, financially, but also morally. And even at a time when it could be said of the Israelites, generally speaking, as we read at the end of the book of Judges, Judges 21 and verse 25, that all the people did what was right in their own eyes, that's kind of the tone for the book of Judges. That's how people were. But here we find a man who is evidently concerned about God's law and doing things God's way and honoring God. And so Boaz was willing to share the blessings that God had given to him with other people. And that may be one of the reasons why he had him in the first place. Proverbs 19, verse 17. Whoever is generous to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will repay him for his deed. God does that. And so Boaz, when you look at this chapter, Boaz went well beyond what the law of Moses required with regard to the rights of a gleaner. He went well beyond that. He gave Ruth permission to drink from that water that was drawn by his servants there in verse 9. When you're thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn. That's not standard practice in ancient Israel. Anyone who went into the field to glean would be responsible for taking care of their own things and drawing their own water. In doing so, they would lose time that they could otherwise spend in gathering food. And so basically, Boaz gave Ruth an advantage by allowing her to do that. Furthermore, he shared his meal with her. Look at verse 14. Come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine. Invited her to his resting place at mealtime, and he gave her bread and vinegar and some roasted grain as well. In fact, he gave her so much that she couldn't even eat all of it. That certainly wasn't a common practice for a landowner in his dealings with those who came to glean in his field. And finally, Boaz made special provisions for her. Again, verse 15 and 16. He would tell his servants, let her glean even among the sheaves. They weren't supposed to do that typically. And don't reproach her. Pull out from the bundles for her and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her. And so obviously Boaz is paying special attention to Ruth. She went to glean in someone's field for the day, and she returns home. You can imagine when she walks through the door, and she's carrying somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 50 pounds of grain. That's how much the description is there of, we don't know all the Hebrew stuff about, when I read it, I don't know exactly what that is. But when you calculate it out, that's about how much she had, somewhere in that neighborhood. And that's only the beginning. That'd be enough for her and Naomi to eat for about 2 weeks. And one day she does that. And Boaz makes provision for her to do that throughout the couple of months or so that they're going to have harvest time. I used to think that Boaz did all of these things because he was interested in Ruth. And that may be what's going on, I'm not saying that couldn't be it. But I don't think that's it. That's probably how Hollywood would portray it. Let's just be honest about that. But I don't necessarily think that's what we're being told. Boaz tells us why he did it, actually. Look at verses 11 and 12 again. All that you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. This is a lot like the passage in James chapter 2 when you see someone hungry and you say, be warmed and filled, and do nothing for them. When Boaz says, the Lord repay you for what you've done and a full reward be given you by the Lord, what Boaz does then is he says, the Lord's blessed me, and I'm going to be the agent through which that takes place. Because of who you are and what you've done, I in turn am going to do this for you. That's why he did it. And by the end of the chapter, I'll go ahead and tell you, I do think Naomi begins to realize that Boaz and Ruth would be a pretty good match. And I think that may be what she had in mind in verse 20. When she said, that man is our close relative, he is one of our guardian redeemers. I think she's saying there, you know what? This might be the way out. And we'll read about her plan to get them together in chapter 3. But again, what chapter 2 highlights is their character. And I'll tell you this. What I think this chapter does for us today is it tells us a little bit about what to look for in a spouse, if somebody is looking for one. And so when you're looking for a spouse, here's what you do. You look at a person's character. If there's one thing that stands out about Ruth and Boaz, it is that the best quality of each of them is their character. And so we talked about the fact, excuse me, we talked about the fact that Boaz was kind and compassionate. But I want you to know something else about him that I think is implied in what is said. I don't know for sure, but I wonder if the author of the book had this in mind, a contrast between a man like Boaz and Naomi's husband, Elimelech. Again, I'm not sure if that contrast is meant to be there, but I wouldn't be surprised. When things got difficult in Israel, Elimelech decided to head for Moab. Boaz did not. He stayed right where the Lord said he would bless his people if they served him. He evidently trusted the Lord to see to his needs. He trusted in God, in the grace of God, and he was willing to extend grace to other people. And some of that may be a little bit of reading between the lines in the book, but there can be no doubt about the fact that Boaz was a man of noble character. What we know about Ruth's character can be expressed in the words that Boaz said to her in chapter 3 and verse 11. You are a worthy woman. Here we have a woman who risked her future and risked her happiness, and she set herself on a course to take care of a person who could never give her anything back in terms of material possessions or financial security. That's who Ruth was. And I believe Boaz had a pretty good idea about all of that, about who Ruth was before he ever met her face to face. When we look at what he said up there in verses 11 and 12 about what she had done for her mother-in-law, it was obvious to Boaz from the beginning that she was a woman of noble character. And I recognize that it is completely normal to first notice a person's looks. That's just how that works, man. But what I want us to see is that you also need to look at a person's character. We need to recognize that it is possible for someone to spend far more time being concerned with what they look like on the outside than they do making sure they are the right kind of person on the inside. And we read about stuff like that in Scripture. In 1 Peter chapter 3, for example, and beginning in verse 3, Peter would be talking to women here, but same principle apply across the board. But he would say, do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry or the clothing you wear. That's not where the beauty is. But let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. That's where it needs to come from. And I'm not saying, here's the deal. You can quote me on this. I'm not saying that anybody needs to go out there and marry someone ugly. That's not it. That's not the point of the lesson this morning. But what I am saying is that what we need to do is we need to recognize what real beauty is. And anyone who doesn't know what real beauty is needs to put off getting married until they do. It'll save them a great deal of trouble somewhere along the way. Okay, one more point, then I'm going to finish coughing and the lesson will be yours. I also want to suggest that one of the ways you can determine a person's character, at least partially, is to look at their relationships. Everything we know about the relationships of both Ruth and Boaz implied that they were good people. I mean, isn't that what we see in this chapter? Think about Boaz. When he arrived at his field, the very first thing he did was greet his workers, not with, get back to work. That's not it. The Lord be with you, he says in verse 4. We later find him eating a meal with his servants. I don't think that was normal. We've already talked about his generosity, even with strangers. And so by all accounts, Boaz was a good man. You see it even in his relationships, daily relationships. And when we look at Ruth, we've already talked about some of her commendable qualities. A Moabite woman willing to leave her family and her homeland to serve her mother-in-law and the Lord. That's who she is. And there's no guarantee of her well-being, but she was dedicated. She was willing to do whatever she could to see to the needs of a person that she cared about deeply. By all accounts, Ruth was a remarkable woman. And so what we see in this passage are two people who knew how to love other people. That's important. I believe that anyone who considers entering into the most sacred of all human relationships needs to take a long look at their prospective mate's people skills. How do they function in their relationships? How do they get along with their family? How do they get along with the people they deal with on a daily basis? And the reason I think these questions ought to be asked is because that's precisely how they're going to deal with the person they start a new family with and promise to spend the rest of their life with. Look at a person's relationships. That's important. One of the great themes in the book of Ruth is the providence of God. And in the days of Ruth, people didn't believe that, things just kind of happen. God was behind all of it, whether it was good, whether it was bad. And so God was expressing his providential care behind what we might call ordinary life. And when you look at the events of this book, can anyone really look at what happened and conclude that, this is just blind chance or coincidence that is responsible for the way things are playing out? I don't think so. There's one thing the book of Ruth should teach us. It's that we serve a God who is in control and that he's still at work in this world. I mean, yes, the time when miracles were being performed, that has ceased. But that doesn't mean that God has been relegated to just a spectator on the sidelines. And we may not always be able to recognize the details, but we do need to recognize the fact that God still works in the lives of people today. Do we believe that? We should. And if we do, And what we need to do is we need to work with him. And we do that by being the kind of people he wants us to be, having the kind of character he wants, and striving to do that in all of the things that all of the activities, all of the relationships we have in life. It's what God expects of us, to be his people, to be the kind of people that he has called us to be. And that's what we see in chapter 2 of the book of Ruth. If you're here this morning, we haven't talked about particularly our relationship with God, especially not in terms of how that is established, and certainly not under the new covenant. But if you are someone who believes in Jesus, but you've never obeyed the gospel of Christ, then why not this morning do that? Believe he's the Son of God. If you want to live the kind of life that he wants you to live, to turn away from sin, repent of those things, and come and confess the name of Jesus, that he's Lord. That's who he is, whether we confess it or not. It's to our advantage to acknowledge that, and then to act like it, to be buried with Christ in baptism, where we can be raised up and walk with him in newness of life. And if you're here this morning, if you've never done that, we want to encourage you to do so. If you have some questions about that, come see me after services. We'll talk about that some. But if we can help you, we ask you to come as we stand and as we sing.